The slap echoed through the street like a gunshot. Conversation stopped. Footsteps froze. Every head turned. A police officer had just struck a man, hard, right across the face, right there, under the streetlights in front of a growing crowd. Phones were already in the air, recording. The man staggered half a step, then stood still. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't even glare back. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and looked straight at the officer, calm, unshaken, almost disappointed. "You think you can just stand there and stare at me?" The cop barked. The man said nothing. Another officer laughed. "Looks like we found ourselves a tough guy." Someone in the crowd whispered. That slap was uncalled for, but the officers didn't care. To them, this was just another face, another suspect, another nobody standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. What they didn't know, what no one there knew, was that they had just slapped the wrong man. The man took a slow breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled. "Officer," he said calmly, "you're making a mistake." The cop scoffed. "Oh yeah, you all say that." The crowd grew larger. A woman covered her mouth. A man shook his head in disbelief. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "They just hit him." Still, the man didn't move. No resistance, no threats, no anger. Only composure. Because it wasn't weakness. It was restraint. The officer stepped closer, chest puffed out. "What are you going to do about it?" For a moment, silence ruled the street. Then the man slowly turned his face back toward the officer. His eyes were steady, focused, not the eyes of a victim, the eyes of someone who had seen far worse and survived it. "My name," he said quietly, "is Steven Seagal." The name meant nothing to the officer, but within minutes, it would mean everything. And when the truth came out, the slap that felt powerful seconds ago would become the biggest mistake of that officer's career. The street didn't explode into chaos right away. Instead, it held its breath. Steven Seagal stood exactly where the officer had slapped him, his feet planted on the concrete as if the ground itself had asked him not to move. Traffic hissed by in the distance. A bus exhaled at the corner somewhere. Music thumped faintly from an open car window. The two officers didn't notice any of it. They were too busy enjoying the moment. "You hear that?" the first cop said to his partner, tapping his baton lightly against his palm. "Quiet now, that's what respect sounds like." Steven said nothing. The officer leaned closer, close enough that Steven could smell coffee on his breath. "You freeze up when you're scared, huh?" Steven's eyes stayed level. Not challenging. Not submissive, just steady. "I'm not scared," he said calmly. "I'm giving you space to correct yourself." That line drew laughter, from the officers and a few nervous onlookers who didn't know whether to be afraid or amused. "Oh, he's a philosopher." The second cop mocked. "You hear that? Space to correct ourselves." A young man in the crowd whispered to his friend, "Man, this doesn't feel right." Steven shifted his weight slightly, slow and deliberate. His hands remained visible, relaxed at his sides. Every movement was controlled, measured, like someone who understood exactly how fast things could go wrong. "Let me ask you something," Steven said quietly. "Who called this in?" The first cop's smile vanished. "You don't ask questions here." "I'm trying to help," Steven replied. That only irritated them more. The officer stepped back and raised his voice, making sure the crowd could hear. "We got a report of a suspicious individual loitering. Guess who fits the description?" A woman near the back frowned. "He's just standing there." "Ma'am, step back," the officer snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Steven glanced toward her and gave a small nod, almost apologetic. That gesture, small, respectful, somehow made the situation worse. The second officer grabbed Steven's arm. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. Steven didn't pull away, but he didn't comply either. He simply turned his head slightly. "If you touch me like that again," he said evenly, "you're going to create a situation you don't want." The crowd gasped. The officer tightened his grip. "Is that a threat?" "No," Steven said. "It's a warning." The first cop stepped in close again. "You think you're special?" Steven met his eyes. "I think you're confused." That was enough. The officer shoved Steven backward, not hard, but hard enough to prove a point. Stephen stumbled one step, then caught himself. Still no resistance, still no anger. But the air changed. People felt it. A man filming whispered, "This guy's different." The officer reached for his radio. "Dispatch. We've got an uncooperative subject refusing commands." Stephen's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but calculation. "Listen carefully," Stephen said, his voice low but carrying. "I've trained people who wear your uniform. I've stood where you stand, and I'm telling you, slow down." The officer laughed. "Sure you have." Before Stephen could say another word, the screech of tires cut through the tension. Another police cruiser pulled up fast. The crowd shifted, murmuring louder now. A door opened. Boots hit the pavement. A taller figure stepped out. Older, broader shoulders, stripes on his sleeve. He scanned the scene once. Then his eyes locked on Steven Seagal, and everything changed. His posture stiffened. His jaw tightened. His face went pale. "Everybody stand down," he said sharply. The two officers froze. "Sir?" one of them asked, confused. "Did you not hear me?" The senior officer snapped. "Stand down now." Stephen slowly turned toward him. The senior officer took one step closer, his voice suddenly respectful. "Mr. Seagal," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" A shockwave rippled through the crowd. "Mr. Seagal? Wait, Steven Seagal? No way." The two younger officers stared, their confidence draining from their faces. Stephen nodded once. "I'm fine." The senior officer swallowed hard, and that's when the truth finally caught up to everyone. The words hung in the air like smoke. "Mr. Seagal, are you all right?" For a moment, no one moved. The crowd that had been whispering only seconds earlier now stood in stunned silence. Phones trembled in raised hands. Mouths hung open. The two younger officers looked from Stephen to the senior officer, their faces draining of color as reality began to sink in. Stephen nodded calmly. "I'm fine," he said. "But this didn't have to happen." The senior officer exhaled slowly, as if trying to keep his composure. He turned sharply toward the two cops. "Step away from him now." They obeyed instantly. One of them stammered. "Sir, we didn't know." "That's obvious." The senior officer snapped. "Radio dispatch and cancel the call, immediately." The officer fumbled with his radio, hands shaking. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by panic. Stephen looked around at the crowd. He saw fear, curiosity, anger, and something else too. Relief. Relief that someone powerful had finally been the one on the receiving end. A man near the front spoke up. "So if he wasn't famous, would this have been okay?" The question hit harder than the slap. The senior officer stiffened but didn't answer. Stephen did. "That's the question that matters," he said quietly. The officer who had slapped him swallowed hard. "Sir, I apologize. I thought you were resisting." Stephen turned to face him fully for the first time. "No," he said calmly. "You thought I was powerless." The officer's eyes dropped. "I said I was cooperating," Stephen continued. "You didn't listen, you reacted." The senior officer rubbed his forehead, clearly aware that dozens of cameras were capturing every second. "This situation has gotten out of hand," he said. "We'll handle this internally." Murmurs of disagreement rippled through the crowd. "Internally?" someone scoffed. "That's it," another voice shouted. Stephen raised his hand slightly, signaling for calm. "This isn't about punishment for spectacle," he said. "It's about accountability." He turned to the senior officer. "Tell me, what happens if I don't have this face, this name?" The officer hesitated. Stephen waited. Finally, the senior officer answered quietly, "Then this would have gone very differently." The admission hit like a punch. Stephen nodded slowly. "That's the problem." One of the younger officers' voices cracked. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Stephen looked at him steadily. "Your job isn't force. It's judgment." Silence followed. The officer who had slapped him stepped forward, trembling. "I lost my temper. That was wrong." Stephen studied him for a long moment. "You didn't lose your temper," he said. You exercised it. That sentence spread through the crowd like wildfire. The senior officer straightened. Both officers will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Gasps erupted. The slapped officer's knees nearly buckled. Stephen didn't look satisfied. He didn't look angry either. He looked disappointed. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want change." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd now. "Authority doesn't come from a badge," Stephen said. "It comes from restraint. From how you treat the person who can't fight back." The senior officer nodded. "We'll review body cam footage and witness statements." "Good," Stephen replied. "Because they tell the real story." A woman near the back wiped her eyes. "Thank you for saying something." Stephen gave her a small nod. Then he looked back at the officers. "Tonight," he said, "you didn't slap a famous man. You slapped a citizen." He paused. "And every citizen deserves dignity." The senior officer took a step back and addressed the crowd. "This interaction is concluded. Please disperse." But no one moved right away. They were still processing what they'd just witnessed. The two younger officers were escorted to the patrol car, heads down, the weight of the moment finally crushing them. Stephen stood alone again, hands in his pockets, posture calm. The street slowly returned to motion. But something had shifted. People didn't just see a celebrity that night, they saw a mirror. And not everyone liked what it reflected. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. It didn't matter who posted it first. It didn't matter which angle showed the slap most clearly. What mattered was the moment. A police officer striking a calm man on a public street, the man refusing to fight back, and the sudden shift when the truth was revealed. Steven Seagal. News stations replayed the clip on loop. Social media tore it apart frame by frame. Police brutality or misunderstanding. Officers slapped Steven Seagal. What really happened? When power meets restraint. Everyone had an opinion, but one detail stood out to millions of viewers. Steven's reaction: no rage, no threats, no lawsuits announced, just calm. At police headquarters, the mood was anything but calm. The chief sat at the head of the conference table, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the paused video playing on a large screen. The image froze on the exact moment of impact. The slap, the shock on the crowd's faces, Steven's steady posture afterward. "This is bad," the chief said quietly. A deputy cleared his throat. "Worse than bad. This is a public trust issue." Body cam footage confirmed everything. No resistance, no threat, no justification. The officer's earlier reports didn't match the footage. That alone triggered an internal investigation. Across the city, protests formed. Not violent, not chaotic, but loud. Signs read, "Respect is not optional, badge pay power. What if he wasn't famous?" That last one echoed everywhere. Stephen watched the coverage from his hotel room, arms folded, expression unreadable. He hadn't called a lawyer. He hadn't posted a statement. Until his phone rang. The police chief, "Mr. Seagal." The chief said carefully, "I want to personally apologize." "I appreciate that," Stephen replied, "but apologies aren't solutions." The chief hesitated. "What would you like to see happen?" Stephen didn't answer right away. "Training," he finally said. "Accountability and transparency." The chief nodded, even though Stephen couldn't see him. "We can arrange that." Later that day, Stephen stood before a row of microphones. Reporters shouted questions. "Stephen, are you pressing charges? Was this a setup? Do you think police abuse power?" Stephen raised a hand. The noise faded. "I'm not here as a celebrity," he said calmly. "I'm here as a citizen." Cameras clicked. "What happened to me happens to people every day," he continued. "The difference is, you recognized my name." That line hit harder than any accusation. A reporter asked, "So what should happen to the officers?" Stephen's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but seriousness. "They should be judged fairly," he said. "Just like anyone else." That night, one of the officers sat alone in his apartment staring at his phone. Messages flooded in, some hateful, some sympathetic, none comforting. He replayed the moment again and again. The slap, the silence. The name, for the first time. He didn't feel powerful. He felt small. At headquarters, The senior officer who had intervened submitted a full report, refusing to soften the facts. "This stops here," he told his captain. "If we cover this up, we become the problem." Public pressure mounted. Sponsors questioned contracts. City officials demanded answers. Civil rights groups requested meetings. And in the middle of it all, Stephen remained quiet. Until he released one final statement. Not an attack, not a threat, just a reminder. Authority is not measured by force, but by restraint, and respect must be given before it is demanded. The city listened and waited, because everyone knew the real consequences were still coming. The city council chamber was packed. Every seat was filled. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the outcome everyone knew would set a precedent. At the front of the room, the police chief sat stiffly, hands folded. Beside him were internal affairs officials, legal advisors, and representatives from the Civilian Oversight Board. The two officers sat alone at a small table, no badges on display. No confidence left. The footage played one final time. The slap, the silence, the man who refused to fight back. When the screen went dark, the room stayed quiet. The chief cleared his throat. After reviewing body, camera footage, witness statements, and internal reports, this department finds that excessive force was used without justification. Gasps rippled through the chamber. One officer closed his eyes. The verdict continued. Both officers are suspended without pay. Mandatory retraining will be required. One officer will face formal disciplinary review that may result in termination. The words landed heavy, but Steven Seagal wasn't in the room. He didn't need to be. He was walking through a small neighborhood park across town, hands behind his back, listening to the sound of children laughing. No cameras, no security, just life continuing. His phone buzzed once. A single message from the police chief. "It's done." Stephen nodded to himself and put the phone away. That evening, a community meeting was held, not televised, not scripted. Officers sat among residents, no uniforms, no ranks, just people. Stephen attended quietly, sitting in the back. A young man stood up. "If this was any of us," he said, voice shaking, "would anyone have listened?" The room went still. Stephen rose slowly. "They listened because they had to," he said. "But they should listen because it's right." He turned to the officers present. "Their respect isn't automatic," Stephen continued. "It's built every day, interaction by interaction." An older officer nodded. "We forget that sometimes." "Yes," Stephen replied. "And when you forget, people get hurt." Later, Stephen walked outside alone. The city lights glowed softly. Sirens echoed far away, but quieter now. Distant. A reporter approached him cautiously. "Stephen, one last question. Do you feel vindicated?" Stephen considered the word. "No," he said. "I feel responsible." "For what?" "For not using this moment to make noise, but to make progress." The next week, the department announced new training protocols, de-escalation workshops led by independent instructors. Civilian review participation expanded. Body cam policies tightened, small changes but real ones. The officer who had slapped Stephen submitted a written apology, not to him but to the public. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. Stephen never responded publicly. He didn't need to. The story slowly faded from headlines, replaced by the next outrage, the next debate. Months passed. The city moved on, as cities always do. New headlines replaced old ones. New arguments filled the airwaves. But beneath the noise, something subtle had changed. At the police academy, recruits now watched a familiar video during training. Not as entertainment, not as gossip, as a lesson. The instructor paused the footage right before the slap. "What went wrong here?" he asked the room. Hands went up. Ego. Lack of patience, assuming guilt. The instructor nodded. "And what saved this from becoming worse?" A young recruit answered quietly. "The man didn't escalate." That answer lingered. Across the city, officers were being retrained, not just on tactics, but on tone, judgment, and restraint. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But conversations were happening that hadn't happened before, all because one man chose calm over chaos. Steven Seagal didn't attend ceremonies. He didn't accept awards. When a community organization invited him to speak, he showed up quietly, sat in the back, and listened more than he talked. A teenager raised his hand. "Why didn't you fight back?" Steven looked at him for a long moment. "Because winning a moment can cost you a future," he said. That answer spread faster than any clip ever had. Meanwhile, one of the officers involved struggled in silence. Without the uniform, without authority, he was just another man facing his reflection. He attended counseling as part of the disciplinary process. In one session, the counselor asked, "What were you feeling right before you struck him?" The officer hesitated. "Power," he admitted, "and fear." That realization broke him. For the first time, he understood that the slap hadn't been about control over another man. It had been about control over himself. He began volunteering, quietly, away from cameras. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect it. He just tried to be better. Steven heard about it through a third party. He said nothing. That silence wasn't indifference. It was respect for genuine change. One evening, Steven walked past the same street corner where it had all happened. The CAF was still there. The street lights still buzzed. People still passed by without looking up. Life unchanged on the surface. A stranger recognized him and nodded. "Thank you," the man said simply. Steven nodded back and kept walking. That was enough, because the real legacy wasn't policy changes or headlines. It was the pause people took now. Before reacting, before judging, before using force. The incident became a reference point. Not remember when a cop slapped Steven Seagal, but remember when calm changed the outcome, and that was the difference. Steven never told the story himself. He didn't need to, others told it for him. In classrooms, in training rooms, in quiet conversations between parents and children. A reminder passed from one person to another. That dignity is not weakness. That restraint is not surrender. That respect should never depend on who someone is, as Steven later wrote in a private journal, never meant for publication. The greatest strength is knowing when not to use it. And that became the final lesson, not shouted, not forced, simply lived. Years later, people would still talk about that night, not because a celebrity was involved, not because a video went viral, but because of what didn't happen. There was no fight. No lawsuit circus, no revenge tour, just a moment, where power met restraint, and restraint won. Steven Seagal rarely spoke about it. When he did, it was never dramatic, never emotional, almost detached. "That night wasn't about me," he once said quietly. "It was about choice." Choice. That was the word that stayed with people. The officer chose force. Steven chose calm. The city chose reflection. At least for a moment. And that moment mattered. At a small seminar months later, a police instructor ended his session with a simple question. "Who remembers the Seagal incident?" Every hand went up. "Good," the instructor said. "Then remember this. Authority doesn't excuse behavior. It exposes it." In the audience sat young recruits who would one day patrol streets, knock on doors, face fear and uncertainty. They didn't see a movie star in that story. They saw a test across town. A father showed the video to his teenage son. "Why didn't he hit back?" the boy asked. The father paused. "Because strength isn't always loud," he said. "Sometimes it's knowing you don't need to prove anything." That answer stayed with the boy. Steven, meanwhile, returned to his quiet routines, morning walks, training sessions, teaching a small group of students who didn't care about fame, only discipline. One student asked him, "Sensei, how did you stay calm?" Steven tied his belt slowly before answering. "Because anger gives control to the other person," he said, "and I don't give control away." That lesson went beyond martial arts. It became a way of living. The street where it happened never got a plaque. No sign marked the spot. No one took selfies there. And yet, every time an officer paused before reacting, every time a citizen chose words over fists, Every time someone showed respect before demanding it. That night lived on. Not as a headline, as a habit. As a reminder. The world is loud. Egos are fragile. Power is often misunderstood. But dignity. Dignity is universal. Stephen once wrote in a notebook he kept private, "You will never regret choosing restraint. You may regret choosing force." That line never went viral. But it didn't need to, because the people who needed it most remembered it. And now, so do you.